Alrighty, cool. Sorry for the little hiatus. There's been a lot of it. But now we're going to go into something kind of a new field, that is computation theory. I don't know what it'd be called. Software theory, maybe. But this is David Golumbia's book, The Cultural Logic of Computation, which is an interesting read. I would obviously recommend it to anyone because I'm doing it here. And it's pretty accessible. It doesn't get very deep into the kind of nitty-gritty algorithmic type stuff indicative of people like Wendy Chun or anyone like that, or something in the domain of like media history or software history with like Lisa Gettleman. So this is really approachable. And what's interesting, I found, is because he's considering computation, considering software, the internet, things like that, in relation to the kind of continental philosophical tradition. So he takes up thinkers like Derrida, in interesting ways, and Foucault as well, that I think that for some, when they think of software, when they think of the kind of analytic framework behind computers and what they mean, would be more inclined to go towards the analytic side of philosophy. So they look at thinkers like, from Aristotle up to Locke to Wittgenstein to Bertrand Russell, whatever, which he does a bit here, but it's really focused on the kind of continental stuff, which is, as someone would probably be able to tell, is certainly up my alley. So for that reason, it's a fun read. It's not very analytical and it's not very dry. It's pretty accessible. But to kind of begin it, I want to start by reading off actually part of the conclusion, which is odd. I don't normally do this. But he gives a really good summary of what he had tried to do throughout the book, because I don't find his introduction is as good as his conclusion. He says, the main goal of this book has been to describe a set of ideological phenomena, the functions of the discourse of computationalism in contemporary social formations, the imbrication of that discourse in a politics that seems strikingly at odds with a discourse of liberation that has more and more come to characterize talk of computers, and the disconnect between the capabilities of physical computers and the ideology of computationalism that underwrites much of our own contemporary investment in being digital. And then he continues, because human beings as such is terrifically mutable, especially on an anti-essentialist post-structuralist account like the one endorsed here, there is little doubt that the more we imagine ourselves to be like computers, the more computer-like we will be. Conversely, the more we imagine computers can take over socio-political functions, the more we will give up our own influence over those phenomena, and the more they will pass into the domain of exactly the powerful agents, states, transnational corporations, and capital itself that already dominates so much of social life. So that, for me, occurs on, someone says I should give page numbers, page 221, right at the first page of the epilogue. So this sets the kind of groundwork for what's going to be going on here, and sorry for the long quote. One of the other things I want to mention, and that he's very clear about, is he wants to shift the focus of the kind of determinist thinkers of technology, that is, those people who think that with the introduction of technology, we see something fundamentally new occurring in relation to the human condition, whether it be in the form of a kind of oppression or a kind of liberation. So you have two broad camps, those people that say that technology will be the end of us because it, turns people into computers or turns people into kind of binary formations that can be easily mapped and controlled. And then you have the other people that think that the computer, and I just use the computer as one example, but you can extend this to all kinds of media, all kinds of technology. That is, the computer or whatever else will be a zone for liberation, will open up a kind of democratic potential. So he wants to get away from both of those kinds of approaches and say, in fact, this is part of a greater kind of historical phenomenon. That is computationalism. So where we might think that computationalism is a direct correlate of computers, hence the computation, in fact, he says that this goes way back. This is part of our kind of cultural zeitgeist. So for that reason, he says that we are misguided if we place so much kind of authority in technology and in computers themselves. So there are two levels to the computer for him, as just, again, one example. There's what goes on under the surface. So we're thinking of code, we're thinking of algorithms, anything like that. And then there's what's on the surface, so the user interaction with it. Now these are both two very different things. And there are two very different things that I'll try to kind of sift out over the course of this kind of talk. So to begin the book, I guess, on page 1, he gives us the idea that computers resonate very well. That is, they seem to sing in harmony with what he calls the rationalist theory of mind. So this is indicative of such kind of analytic thinkers like Leibniz or whoever else that would be, or Descartes for that matter, that would fall into the kind of rationalist philosophical tradition, whatever that might look like, whether it be the heavy emphasis on empiricism or kind of a priori thinking, anything like that, that sees the world as being fundamentally material and therefore understandable, quantifiable. So he says that this is very seductive because it makes the world, in a sense, pretty easy to understand. So if you're able to reduce the world to numbers, and numbers are very easy to digest, then therefore you're going to be able to control people to some extent. So we can see this certainly happening for anyone in the university. Universities give money to departments that produce numbers, right? So the humanities, anything like that, who cares? Because it doesn't produce numbers. How do you quantify what they're doing? Where a lot of the departments that produce numbers, like real numbers, are full of bullshit. Like you have ethnographic things that have a pretty strong history of being racist, anthropological type things as well, many other kind of domains in the social science and quote unquote hard science that have not actually done kind of real, studies, but have quantified things based off of some already problematic and already incorrect presuppositions or propositions. So the development of the computer resonates with this kind of rationalist approach, or this kind of empirical approach that can reduce everything to numbers. So for that reason, any sort of change, he says, that can be noted in humans with the advent of computers, or again with any other tech, is only a change in degree, not a change in kind, where there's a kind of intensification of what has already been taken place, or what is already taking place, not a kind of radical overhaul of what it means to be human. In fact, it's just an extension of it, and if anything, it's a kind of solidification, which he gets into a little later. But to kind of elaborate briefly, the computer, in its intensification of what has slowly been kind of boiling, kind of cooking in the cult. Oh, someone dropped something downstairs. All right, yeah. So where was I? The computer just harnesses, galvanizes, and kind of solidifies what has been occurring in the kind of cultural logic of the time. So it's a kind of physical manifestation of what was a cultural phenomenon, that is the kind of rationalist theory of mind. So what is different, not only in this kind of intensification, which is kind of own domain of thought, but Golumbia also approaches this in another way, suggesting that the intensification or the kind of physical embodiment of this rationalist paradigm allows for other modes of kind of oppression to seep in, capitalize on that type of empiricism or that kind of rational embodiment. So that's when you have like oppressive corporations like Amazon. How is it that Amazon is possible to deliver things in 2 days or less? It's because they have a number of algorithms that they've relied on that have essentially predicted where people are going to want to order things, already deliver it to those kinds of hubs, and then make it, facilitate, kind of expedite the process of getting people the products that they buy. So it's just one example. So this reduces people, of course, to a kind of codification. But again, it's important to note that this is not new. This is really, as Golumbia makes very clear, just an intensification of it. So what some people might think, and this is one of the kind of big arguments that Golumbia lays out, is that because humans are so so accommodating to this computationalism and are so ready to accept the logic of computers, then to some extent that might mean that the human brain is like a computer to some extent. So he says that this is indicative of these kind of analytic philosophers, but also in the linguistic tradition. So he'll come to take on Chomsky for that reason. So of this, and I will turn back to that last passage I read, or the passage from the conclusion that I read, where he says that because human beings as such is terrifically mutable, especially on an anti-essentialist, post-structuralist account like the one endorsed here, there's little doubt that the more we imagine ourselves to be like computers, the more computer-like we will become. And then conversely, the same thing. So it's not so much that the human brain is ontologically, that is kind of naturally, like a computer, but in fact, because the human is a kind of tabula rasa, I think I said that right, kind of blank slate, then the human brain can kind of become a computer. So it's not to say that that is what it is by default, but rather, and these kind of linguistic philosophers, or these kind of linguistic thinkers that we'll come into, are unable to recognize, at least this is what Golumbia says, unable to recognize that it has nothing to do with a kind of natural state of the human. And this is what they fail to imagine, but it rather has to do with the human being kind of becoming something else. So for instance, I can frame this another way. If I was a researcher and I wanted to study some kind of rural community, and I wanted to see if people there liked to vote, but they didn't have voting stations, I would go and then they would, probably tell me they don't like to vote or are ambivalent about it. But then let's say there was suddenly a kind of cultural shift and they had, voting stations. It's kind of a weak example, but whatever. Then I would get very different results. So there isn't really anything wrong with my method there, but it would be wrong to kind of generalize either of my findings, where in the former, where they didn't have voting stations, I wouldn't be able to generalize and say that these people are just predisposed to not liking voting. And in the latter, I wouldn't say that they're predisposed to liking voting either. That's what some of these people, at least that Golumbia will take aim at, fail to do. They fail to see that there are of course, cultural influences that would turn the brain into something like a computer. Or if we have measuring kind of devices to measure the human brain or to measure kind of linguistic capacity, then there is, and this is kind of branching off a little bit, but there is other kinds of theories that postulate that the very object of study will match, in a sense, the tools used to study it. So you could see that the object of study actually becomes the measuring tools used to measure it, used to quantify it, or the medium is the message. So this kind of medium in the realm of computers is what he says the cultural logic of computation, which precedes computers. However, we only really, as theoreticians, as philosophers or whatever, only really see things in terms of their physical embodiment. This is also a relic of the kind of hyper-rationalist philosophical approaches that I've kind of alluded to that see the world as material. Now, if there is an extension of that thought into the present day, then it would follow that the only things that we could see as being communicating that kind of computationalism would be physical objects. So for that reason, we then turn to the thing like the computer. We then turn to other technologies in order to, provide a kind of template for that analysis, which Golumbia says is wrong. There is something that's going on underneath that has a historical character to it. So now we'll move into those linguists that he takes aim at. So one such thinker is Chomsky, and I don't want to get into all the other ones that kind of make an appearance because, I could kind of present them and whatever. Whereas I think for the most part, people know who Chomsky is. So Golumbia says that there are two sides to Chomsky, and I think that everyone knows this. There's the political side, the manufacturing consent side, the anti-war side, anti-billionaire side, and then you have the linguist. So Golumbia says that with those two sides, you have a very kind of liberal, almost radical persona or personality, and then the other side, you have a rather conservative one. And Golumbia is trying to think, how is that really possible? Why is it that we have these two sides of this guy? Well, he says that the reason we have a kind of conservative Chomsky is because he is deeply embedded within what Golumbia calls the Western intellectual apparatus. So that is a kind of extension of that rationalistic, empirical dogma that came out of, the kind of analytic philosophical tradition or the early sciences or whatever. So Chomsky then advocates for what Golumbia recognizes as being a Cartesian rationalism. Cartesian coming from Descartes, so this kind of Cartesian human, thing. And Golumbia recognizes or sees in Chomsky a desire to see the brain, as though it was a computer, or though it is a computer. So for that reason, Golumbia says that Chomsky's popularity is not at all random. In fact, it communicates the very logic of our world, that is the cultural logic of computation, that makes it so easy for people to grasp onto. So then Golumbia, and I'm just kind of going to allude to this quickly because it'll come into to fruition a little more, there are gendered components to this as well as kind of language politics and racial implications as well, where he says that it's no coincidence that Chomsky's popular in general, but there's also no coincidence that he's popular with white guys, like the kind of Bernie bro type people. So his whole kind of critique of Chomsky is in some ways, it kind of echoes or mirrors, and he never takes them up in this book, but Deleuze and Guattari, or he doesn't take them up in this capacity, who say that Chomsky, in considering, I can't remember this off the top of my head, it's one of the plateaus in 1,000 Plateaus where they take on Chomsky. They say that Chomsky, or they wonder why Chomsky refuses to forget that the only reason kind of majority languages or kind of majoritarian languages, that is, standard English or French or, Spanish or Mandarin or whatever, it's only possible that such things are actually considered to be majoritarian or considered to be kind of profound languages is because there are other smaller ones, dialects, other kinds of kind of in-between languages that are needed as a point of reference. So it seems as though for Deleuze and Guattari that Chomsky just forgets all that, right? Is just not interested, because if you consider that, then you really trouble what languages mean, because then it enters into this domain of a kind of fluidity where you don't just have a kind of technical or a kind of a rational apparatus that can grasp language and then regurgitate it. So you learn English and then you're able to regurgitate it. But rather there's a kind of fluidity to it. There's a kind of hybridity, in fact, that complicates the kind of rationalist, proposal that language can be understood by the human brain because the human brain is like a computer, which would be true if, we look at very select kind of examples, but as soon as we consider things like race and class and colonialism especially, where languages get all muddled up, it's very difficult to, extend these kinds of hypotheses. So there was one experiment that was actually done on a Mohawk language that Golumbia acknowledges that was by linguists laughed at it. They were like, no, that's not a real like language, right? We're just dealing with European languages, which is a whole other set of problems as well. But we're going to get into this a little more after or later. So linguistics wasn't exactly always this way. In fact, there was a kind of quote unquote liberal approach to it, where when someone was a linguist, they understood languages, not all to be a kind of the same thing, right? Where language is just encompasses all kind of speaking dialects, but rather how each one was its own kind of identity. So Chomsky did away with all that, right? And we might think to the debate with Foucault, which I if you haven't watched it, I would recommend it. It's on YouTube, where Chomsky is making the case that all humans have the ability to grasp language to some extent via some kind of innate deciphering apparatus in the human mind, a kind of rationalist one. And therefore, all languages can then be reduced to that very apparatus, to the kind of thing in the brain that understands and grasps the world. So this echoes that same kind of computationalism that Golumbia is pointing out. It really communicates to the people that they are mappable kind of cogs that don't have, are not going to be directly influenced by things outside of their body. Rather, they can just rely on the things that go on inside, inside their head, of course. Which is why, as well, there's no real coincidence that Chomsky's work was taken up by the military as a linguist. Like, how can we understand humans to control them to some extent? To which he's been charged with that, and he's often, he just brushes it off, like, oh, I can't do anything about that. But then he obviously fails to see how his work influences that. And even to digress, I'm very cautious about who subscribes or who listens to this, so I get all the notifications as to who subscribes, and if I see anything that looks a little suspicious, like alt-right type things or anything like that, I don't like it. So I use that as a warning to try and get further and further to the left with my stuff, at least. So I guess it's slightly in defense of Chomsky. It's difficult to know who's going to take up your stuff for what reasons. But where his work gets really troubling, and this comes out in that debate with Foucault, is that Chomsky suggests that because there is a kind of universal human apparatus to grasp language, then therefore there must be a kind of universal human apparatus to understand things like morality, justice, truth, which is where he gets really, problematic, and where he can be in line with thinkers like Steven Pinker and Sam Harris, a kind of supposed, enlightenment, like neo-enlightenment thinkers that are so ridiculously out of tune with what's going on around them that it's almost haunting. But yeah, so that's where the kind of right aspect of him comes in. So to now extend his thought into computers, Golumbia makes a very interesting case that the computers are part of a kind of language politics game or system that privileges some languages over others. So he says that some languages are more susceptible to a kind of computationalist paradigm than others. So we think of the European languages, for example, where it's very easy to binarize these European languages, and therefore it's very easy for them to belong to computers or to work with computers. So you have things like a kind of brain drain occurring where people are not even using their own language when it comes to computing, when it comes to coding, algorithms, or anything like that, and instead are relying on English mostly to try and or to make their place within the globalized market of computation. So of the more than 6,000 languages on Earth, people flock to European ones, primarily English, when it comes to everything computers, and computers are everything. So if I were to go back to one of my earlier statements that the kind of logic of computationalism is, or the history of it, that is tied to the kind of rationalist approach, sorry, I say that funny, that is very in tune with a kind of empirical type thing, then it would follow that people today, wanting to exercise that same kind of rationalist authority, take the world as being somewhat material, see the computer as being the zone of computation, dig under the hood a little bit, and what do they find? English. So then there is the extension, or the idea that, English is, or it could follow that English is a kind of superior language, that English is, the language of the globalized world to some extent, and that is certainly what's going on here, and it is a form of kind of neo-colonialism, and it extends much further than that. I have a friend who is in the military, and I was asking him, he's a pilot, what language do you speak when you're going to all these different countries? How do you communicate with the the air traffic control or whatever? And he says it's it's all English. Right, it's just that's how it goes, which is messed up, right? Like, this is how English is taking over the world. 6,000 languages it has, it's yeah. Anyways, or the UN recognizes like six languages, six or eight, like English, French, Spanish. I'll look it up. Yeah, Russian, Arabic, Chinese, English, French, and Spanish are the languages recognized by the UN. Of 6,000 languages on Earth, 6 are the ones recognized by the United Nations, which is like mind-boggling when they don't even speak the majority of the languages. Like, it's... Anyways, moving on. This is a neo-colonial tool that is the English language being implemented into almost every domain of life, but not on the surface, right? So this is one of the kind of surreptitious modes of control that we are seeing being conducted. So on the surface, it might appear as though the computer is a zone of kind of democratic possibility. It allowed for things like the Arab Spring to occur with people getting together and all that. Which are all good things, and Golumbia makes it clear that he's not denouncing the possibilities of computers or other technology, but he says that we have to be very careful because what is going on underneath is not so promising. So the kind of generalization or the naturalization of English as a language, of the logic of computation as being reducing people to numbers, codes, algorithms, isn't a good thing. And again, it's a change in degree, not in kind. So this is a process that's been going on for a while now. So then Golumbia gets into kind of he takes a little bit of a turn, and he considers video games as being one of those media on computers that reduces the world to very understandable, graspable components. So he thinks about video games like Age of Empires, Civilization, name your kind of real-time strategy game that reduces the world to kind of colonial expeditions in search of, X, Y, and Z commodities or X, Y, and Z goods, and, moves history in a very linear fashion. Where in the case of like Civilization, you start in, discovering agriculture. Then you go on through the same tech tree, all the way to the information age. Every time. That's how it goes. So this reinforces, and this is Golumbia's argument, this reinforces the idea that history is a kind of linear sequence of colonial expeditions, of conflict, of war, that have just propelled us to this point. So we every time we go from point A to point Z. Now, he says that obviously it's much more complicated than that, and that just communicates one kind of understanding of history, the one governed by colonial conflict, that is the ones perpetuated by Europe, the colonial European nations, I should specify, that see the world as being a hurdle to jump over, to circumvent. So every other culture is one that is in our fucking way, and we have to take them over, either culturally, militarily, you name it, diplomatically. And then he makes an interesting point that these video games communicate to us the extent to which there is no room for hybridity. So I did, some videos that I don't think were very good on homie Baba. So Golumbia takes Baba to task here, saying that hybridity is not possible in these video games because it's just destruction, right? You don't have a kind of fluidity occurring where the distinction between colonized and colonizer kind of gets blurred in this middle ground, in this kind of borderland between the two, where there can be a kind of giving and taking. Whereas with these video games, and very much the state of the world leading up to and including this point, it's really about destruction, just eradication. And that comes out of, that is also part of this kind of neo-colonial English paradigm that sees the world as being something that can be, essentially transformed into English speaking, or at least European language speaking, and computational. Because how many people are afraid, especially in the quote-unquote West, to learn a new language? And it's not easy, of course, but people are just generally afraid of it, and they're afraid of people who don't speak their language. That is, I think, an extension, kind of consequence of this cultural logic of computation that only wants to see things in terms of there's us and then there is them, quite simply. So through this process, which is kind of a process of galvanization, that galvanizes people into binary codes, that galvanizes people into a specific kind of language paradigm, Golumbia says that we are seeing a kind of territorialization. So this is in opposition to the idea put forth by Deleuze and Guattari that, we're seeing with these networks, kind of development of these lines of flight and flows, and a kind of possibility of deterritorialization, kind of perpetual deterritorialization, which is going on to some extent, right? Capital doesn't see a limit. Capital doesn't see borders or barriers or anything like that. Golumbia is making the case that at the same time, we are seeing a territorialization because we are seeing the galvanization of language, galvanization of identity, galvanization of computationalism that are all going on underneath the hood. So on the surface, on the level of the computer, we could say there is a relative degree of deterritorialization occurring. So there is a kind of liberatory possibility where people from all different kinds of cultures, all different kinds of backgrounds can meet, discuss, because you have, translating tools or anything like that, can resist, can mount political change, all these types of things, which once again are all good, but they fail to see the extent to which they are predicated, or the condition for their possibility is predicated on this cultural logic of computation that has implications itself. That in the process of turning people into active political agents is doing so by rendering them all computational, rendering them, numbers in a code or algorithms or something like that. So if we think of the history of, in the case of a kind of gendered analysis of this, men perceived as being, the outgoing, in-your-face characters in the world, and women being the ones that are supposed to be submissive, kind of held back. What we are also seeing with this computationalism is what he says, and this is around page 200, I think it's on page 200, 201. What we are seeing is a development of a kind of maleness of technology, or tech becoming male in technology. Or let me rephrase that. Computers are a reflection of the maleness of society. So society governed by the typical attributes associated with men, that is supposedly they're rational, supposedly they're able to speak the truth, supposedly they're very they're valid, or any other kind of term, adjective. In fact, this is just one cultural possibility that happens to have an affinity with computationalism, right? The kind of empirical, rational side, whereas women are hysterical, unpredictable, and ultimately, not wanted. So computationalism has a strong affinity with what is classically understood to be male attributes or male qualities. So then we get, into the very end, and he does what some other thinkers do, and it bothers me. I feel like he felt pressured, because he was laying out all these criticisms, to which someone could say, so what? What are you giving us instead? And then he goes on to say that what we need is communication with real humans, right? So he does, in a sense, undermine his project at the very end, because he suggests that humans somehow stand outside of this cultural logic of computation, whereas up to this point, he was saying that this is a logic that has been going on for a long time. It doesn't have to do with computers per se, and humans are just as susceptible to it. So at the very end, he makes two different kind of claims, saying the same thing, that humans should use language that is verbal, I would assume. So kind of metaphysics of presence here, kind of verbal language with other humans, because that's somehow better. But he also uses another illusion where the computer represents for him what he calls an authoritarian master, whereas other humans, the human with themselves, they're dealing, when they're just thinking or dealing with other humans, they're dealing with what he calls a reasonable governor. So as though he kind of romanticizes the human experience in the form of what is really human, which I would problematize till the end of time, because just taking him at his word, it would seem as though that's not possible. It would seem as though that would simply be another component of the same cultural logic of computation that has been going on for a long time, and that precedes computers. So it just seemed odd to me, kind of out of place. But he probably just felt, compelled to, I guess, give us something. It's hard to say. But I was pretty deliberately quick through this book. There are obviously other characters, and he gets into all the kind of nitty gritty of linguistic theory that isn't, for me, all that important. Like, there are a lot of little details and kind of historical things that are cool and important that you'd get more of just by reading it, not having someone just regurgitate facts. Because my job is to try to make sense of the thing as a whole. So I guess that's that. That was quick, good. For those that tuned in for this, I hope you enjoyed it, and definitely go read it. And Golumbia has a Twitter account. He's pretty vocal. Let me see what it is. Yeah, just D Golumbia on Twitter, and he's a pretty vocal character. Taking on present contemporary social issues. Get into all of them, but for the sake of time. But anyways, for those that made it this far, cool. I hope to see you soon. If not, whatever.